Hi, it's Katrina. Today, I'll be exploring some of the biggest discoveries from the ancient world that you may have never even heard of before, including a giant hand, a mysterious pyramid that is bigger than anything in Egypt, and a sword that defies explanation. The Hand of Hercules. In Jordan, the same country that's home to the legendary Petra, there is the greatest hand from the ancient world. It's the Hand of Hercules himself. Slayer of the Nemean lion, killer of the Hydra, the son of Zeus. I'll be honest with you, the first time I saw the Hand of Hercules, I was doubtful of its authenticity. I kind of thought I was looking at an AI-generated image. But, as I soon came to learn, the hand is 100% real. It's a mystery that more people haven't heard of this incredible hand before, or rather the 3 fingers that it has left. The hand is situated at the peak of a great hill in one of the oldest parts of Amman, inside the ruin of a breathtaking temple. As you can likely guess, the temple is dedicated to our good friend Hercules, or as he was called by the Greeks, Heracles. History tells us that the temple was built between 162 and 166 AD. That was during the occupation of Amman's citadel by Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was the wealthiest man in human history. He had more relative wealth than any billionaire that's alive today. His son, Mad Emperor Commodus, ruled Rome from 180 until 192 AD. Commodus was so crazy that he's been blamed for the end of the Golden Age in Rome. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. He'd even walk around his palace wearing a lion skin, pretending to be the demigod. The Temple of Hercules is now in ruins, as is the statue of the demigod. Based on the 3 fingers left on Hercules' marble hand, the statue likely stood 40 feet tall before it was destroyed. It would have been one of the biggest marble statues to have ever existed. Stone Age tunnels across Europe. 12,000 years ago, you could travel all the way from the remote Scottish Highlands to Turkey by way of enormous underground tunnels. Shocking new evidence has come to light that is going to have you on a flight to Europe with your shovel. German archaeologist Dr. Heinrich Kusk said evidence of the mysterious tunnels has been found hidden underneath hundreds of Neolithic settlements. These are settlements that were made by early humans around the end of the Ice Age. The tunnels are massive. I mean really massive. On a grand scale, like the secret corridors of some subterranean human race. In Bavaria, Germany, scientists have found over 2,100 feet of underground passages. In Austria, about 1,200 feet have been found. Each section of tunnel isn't stretching on for hundreds of miles. You can't go from Scotland to Turkey today using the ancient tunnels, but you may have been able to once upon a time. It's the sheer number of tunnels that lead scientists to believe that they could have once been connected. They move all along the Mediterranean, and nobody knows who built them or what their original purpose was. The tunnels have nooks, chambers, and rooms. Some of the chambers look like they may have been used as a gathering place. They give off somewhat creepy vibes, and you can imagine Stone Age hunters holding rituals inside them. Other chambers may have been used for something much simpler, like food storage. The most exciting theory is that the tunnels were used as a prehistoric motorway. It's especially thrilling when you think about the timeline. 12,000 years ago, mammoths still roamed North America. The great beasts were being hunted by warriors of the Clovis culture with stone spears. But in Europe, people were digging superhighways? Could that really be the case? Scientists don't know what to say about the strange tunnels, but they do exist and were definitely used for something important. Another theory is that they were used as shelters by primitive humans hiding from big, furry cats with fangs. Another theory, one that's a little spookier than the last, is that the tunnels were used as gateways to the underworld. And now for a quick break because it's shout-out time! I want to give a huge thank you to Paul Vamos and Matthew Boylan. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The mystifying Maori Boulders. The Maori Boulders are huge spheres that are scattered across a beach in New Zealand that look like giants were playing a game of bocce ball. Scientists say the stones are natural geological formations. But Maori legend says that the huge stone orbs are the wreckage from a mythical canoe. So I'll let you be the tiebreaker here. The legends of the Maori are always amazing, and I love learning about them. For centuries, locals have attributed the huge stones on the beach to the destruction of Araiteuru. It was a large sailing canoe that crashed on the rocky shoals extending from Shag Point. Eel baskets and calabashes, a type of bottle gourd, washed onto the shore where they turned into giant stone boulders. The Maori say that Shag Point itself, with its jagged rocks, is the petrified hull of the colossal canoe. Scientists often dispel myths and legends. Boulders of Koekoe Beach were molded over millions of years, 60 million years to be precise, during an era known as the early Paleocene. The reason the boulders are so big is that it took so long for them to form. Each one weighs several tons, with some measuring up to 9 feet in diameter. These days, the boulders are partially buried in the sand. They look like cannonballs that were fired from the biggest cannon ever made. Researchers believe that they were initially underground, completely covered. It was only recently that they were revealed thanks to the restless waves. There's one more thing I want to tell you about. If giant cannonballs can't lure you to the beach, go for the seaweed. There are 850 species of seaweed that wash up on the beach here, and a third of them aren't found anywhere else in the world. It's quite the sight. The Grand Statue of Ramses II. There is a huge, ridiculously enormous statue in Egypt that has gone on far too many voyages in its 3,200 years of life. This statue isn't very well known outside of Egypt, but it should be. For the last decade, the statue lived in a temporary storage building in Giza. It was recently transported to the Grand Egyptian Museum inside a custom-made metal cage. Kind of looked like a prisoner. Check out this photo by Kenneth Garrett of National Geographic. The long-dead pharaoh was confined to a metal prison and was transported a mere 1,200 feet to the museum on 2 trailer beds. The statue of Ramses II weighs an astonishing 83 tons and stands over 30 feet high. The sculpture is made from pure granite, and it depicts one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Ramses ruled from 1279 to 1213 BC. He defeated the rivals of Egypt at every turn, including the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, as well as the Canaanites, the Syrians, and the Nubians. Perhaps most importantly, he defeated the Sea Peoples, who had been terrorizing other civilizations in the area around the Mediterranean Sea. All these victories earned him the title of Ramses the Great. He ruled for so long, was so wealthy, and gained so much power that he built statues of himself everywhere. It's his likeness that sits outside the Great Temple at Abu Simbel, standing 65 feet high. But what about this colossus? It has a curious history which all started in the 13th century BC. The stone was transported from quarries in Aswan to the Temple of Ptah, which is located in the ancient capital of Memphis. There, the granite was shaped to look like Ramses, but nobody really knows what happened to it after that. This statue was lost, buried beneath tons of desert sand. Nobody saw it again until it was discovered in 1820 by Italian Egyptologist Giovanni Caviglia. This statue is now one of the biggest of its kind anywhere in the world. Which ancient Egyptian monument do you find the most impressive? Let me know in the comments. Is this the largest pyramid in the world? This pyramid in China is going to make you rethink everything you know about ancient history. It's the biggest pyramid that has ever been discovered. It's a monument that makes the Great Pyramid of Giza look like a toadstool, and that's saying something. Its history, discovery, and potential cover-up are almost too much to take. Take a look at this picture. It was published in the New York Times on May 30th, 1947. It was taken by James Gossman at the end of World War II. James was an American pilot who was on a mission to provide food and supplies to the Chinese military. But something went wrong with his aircraft engine, forcing him to return to an airbase in northern India, forced to fly at a much lower altitude than normal. This was what allowed him to take the photograph of the humongous, totally over-the-top pyramid near the city of Xi'an. James couldn't believe his eyes. You would be shocked too if you were flying over farmland and suddenly saw a pyramid the size of a small mountain. In the aftermath of World War II, a lot of things got overlooked. The public wasn't overly interested in a mysterious pyramid in China with the Cold War on the horizon. After the report from the New York Times in 1947, the photographs James took disappeared for the next 40 years. They didn't show up again until an Australian writer by the name of Brian Crowley found and published one of the pictures. And that's when the public got excited. Based on the photographs of the pyramid, it's a giant. The monument's sides are around 1,000 feet long. The Great Pyramid of Giza is less than 2/3 the size, stretching only 756 feet along each of its sides. Scientists are hoping to learn more about what could be the biggest discovery of the 21st century, but it hasn't been easy. Chinese authorities have rejected the existence of the monument. Even though it can be seen on Google Earth as clear as day, Chinese authorities say it doesn't exist. You're not going to believe this, but the massive pyramid outside Xi'an isn't the only one in China. Ever since the first explorers wandered into the area, like Marco Polo, they returned to Europe with tales of pyramids. Merchants on the Silk Road spoke of great monuments in China. Even modern satellite images prove that there are multiple unexplained pyramids across the country, or at the very least, pyramid-shaped mysteries. What's your take on the Chinese pyramid enigma? Could it be a remnant of a nameless civilization that has yet to be discovered? And if so, why is there so much secrecy surrounding the monument and others like it? What's China trying to hide? The colossal heads of the Olmec Empire. When discussing big archaeological discoveries, there is one giant thing that springs to mind immediately. That one thing is technically a few things. The Olmec colossal heads. They give the term having a big head a whole new meaning. The Olmec heads are impossibly huge. Each of these incredible monuments depicts the head and face of someone who may have once been an Olmec ruler. However, nobody has ever been able to identify who the heads were modeled after. It's also a mystery how they were even made. Here is an incredible example of an Olmec colossal head, photographed by Mary Harsh at the De Young Museum of Fine Arts in San Francisco. You can see the flat nose, the thick lips, and the contemplative eyes. The figure also wears some sort of helmet, which most of them do. It's one of 17 heads that still exist today. 10 have been found in the ancient site of San Lorenzo, and 4 were discovered at La Venta. These were 2 of the most important cities for the Olmec civilization. But who exactly were the Olmec? Most historians believe that they were the greatest Mesoamerican society before the Maya. The Olmec may have even been the Maya's parent civilization. The Olmec didn't just disappear into thin air. It's believed that they evolved into the Maya. It happened gradually, as these things do. The Olmec appeared along the Gulf Coast of Mexico around the year 1200 BC. They continued to flourish and thrive for the next millennia. They developed cities, established trading routes across vast jungles, and perfected their arts. The Olmec had a terrific influence on all the other cultures in Mexico, with their influence still being felt today. When you look at artwork from the Aztec civilization of only 500 years ago, you can see how it was an evolution of Olmec work from 2,500 years earlier. Of all the artwork created by this great and powerful civilization, the colossal heads are the most impressive. Each head was carved from a massive basalt boulder. The largest one is 10 feet tall and weighs about 40 tons. In some cases, the heads were transported over 50 miles to reach their final destination. How the Olmec moved the stones is even more confusing than how the Druids moved Stonehenge's stones in England. Would you believe that these 2 amazing cultures almost overlap? The last stones were laid at Stonehenge around 1600 BC, while the colossal heads of the Olmec were made around 900 BC. It's a 700-year difference, but that's still pretty close, all things considered. The biggest difference was that the Olmec had to drag their stone heads through the jungle. Plain of Jars. The Plain of Jars is considered to be one of the most puzzling places in Southeast Asia for reasons that will soon become obvious. The jars here are massive mortuary vessels that may have been part of an ancient cemetery. On any visit to Laos, the Plain of Jars is a must-see destination on the itinerary. The name is a little misleading though. The Plain of Jars isn't one place, but rather a vast landscape spread across rice paddies, hilltops, and thick, humid forests. There are 60 sites here, with giant jars strewn across the land. The jars are at least 2,000 years old and are incredibly mysterious. They are also a little dangerous to explore because they are surrounded by unexploded bombs. One wrong move here and you can find yourself in serious trouble. It brings me no joy to tell you that between 1964 and 1973, 4 billion pounds of bombs and mines were dropped on Laos. It was part of what is now called the Secret War. The Secret War was fought between the United States and the Communists of North Vietnam. Up to a third of the American-dropped bombs never detonated. They still riddle the countryside, occasionally exploding when a farmer is plowing their field, or when children are out playing, or they're taking the animals out to graze, and it's no safe place for archaeologists to go digging either. The bombs are one reason why the Plain of Jars remains such a mysterious place. The other reason is that it's just too confusing, even for scientists. Each jar is around 9 feet tall, the same height as an Olmec colossal head. They also weigh about 14 tons each. There was no particular formula to make these jars. They were made from everything from sandstone to granite. Some may have had lids at one point, but all of them contained human remains. When French archaeologist Madeleine Colani was exploring this part of Laos in the 1930s, she found jars filled with the ashes of cremated humans. She also found a nearby cave filled with burned bones and human ash. It was Madeleine's opinion that the cave was a crematorium. She believed that the jars were used as funerary vessels. The best comparison I can make is that the giant jars were like funerary urns that people today keep on their mantles. This explanation does make a lot of sense, so you might be wondering where the mystery is. The mystery is that the jars are huge. What in the world does a person need a 14-ton jar for to have their ashes put in? And why were the jars spread across such a vast area for over 1,000 years? Materials have been found from as early as 500 BC and as late as 800 AD. Last but not least, archaeologists don't know who was responsible for creating the jars. The civilization that built the jars is long gone, so that may be a mystery that will never be solved. The giant axes of the Minoans. Could these axes have been wielded by giants? Look at the size of these axes from ancient Crete. They look as if they were wielded by a minotaur straight from Greek mythology. Coincidentally, the axes come from the island where the Minotaur supposedly lived. The Minoan double axes are about twice the size of an average person. They definitely weren't wielded by any mortal man or woman. Even the mighty Amazonian warriors wouldn't have brought such weapons into battle. Hercules would have been the only man to use such a beastly axe in combat. But if they weren't weapons, what were the axes used for? You might be thinking they had something to do with agriculture. It's a good guess, but you're not quite right. If you're thinking ritual, you're a little bit closer. These double-headed axes are called Minoan labrys. And the truth of their purpose is even crazier than you're expecting. They've been discovered all across the island of Crete, excavated from magnificent Minoan cities like Knossos, Phaistos, and Gortyn. The giant axes were made between roughly 1700 and 1300 BC, likely for sacrificial ceremonies. So, how were they used? I'm sure you know what a guillotine is. Marie Antoinette met her end at the guillotine during the French Revolution. The Minoan labrys may have been used in a similar fashion, only they likely weren't used for humans. The Minoans decapitated bulls. They were famously obsessed with bulls, hence the myth of the Minotaur. The double-headed axes were likely used by priestesses to sever the heads of great beasts while performing religious ceremonies. How gruesome is that? The Rude Man Giant of England. Archaeologists may have solved a giant mystery using some tiny snails. It's weird and a little rude, but you're going to love it. The Rude Man, also known as the Cerna Abbas Giant, can be found in Dorset, England. It's one of dozens of geoglyphs that remain carved into hillsides throughout the rural British countryside. I know you're familiar with the Nazca lines. Well, the Cerna Abbas Giant is the British version of Peru's mysterious geoglyphs. only he's got his private showing. He isn't called the Rude Man because he's impolite on the telephone. He's earned his nickname because he is completely nude. He is a giant nude man who wields a club and boasts a very impressive piece of anatomy that stretches 35 feet straight up toward where his belly button should be. From his head to his feet, the Cernabas giant is an astonishing 180 feet. But what is he? The giant is a work of art, a sort of connect-the-dots image made by scratching away layers of grass and dirt to reveal the white chalk of the hill. Then the lines were filled with more chalk taken from a nearby quarry. If you've ever sat on the beach and drawn something in the sand with a stick, congratulations! You made a geoglyph, sort of. His purpose has been unknown for years. Most believe him to be a fertility icon. Local folklore says that couples who got funky on the grassy hill had a better chance of conceiving a child. There was speculation that the Romans carved him in the likeness of Hercules. There were also rumors that the giant was made as a way to mock Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. In 2020, archaeologists decided that it was time to put an end to the speculation. They took some slices out of the giant's feet and analyzed them at their lab. After extensive testing, laser beams, and with help from some snails, archaeologists reached their conclusions. Mike Allen from the research team said that the giant was born around 700 AD during the Saxon period. This was also right around the time that the Vikings began pillaging up and down the coast of England. It's a very exciting thing to learn because for so long, nobody knew if the giant was recent or as ancient as Stonehenge. So now let's get into the whole snail thing. One of the methods scientists used to get an approximate date was snail shell fragments. Trust me, it's surprisingly clever and interesting. In the 1st century AD, Romans began importing fleshy snails to Britain. They were obsessed with eating escargot and needed to breed the snails. Then, in the medieval days, other species of snails hitched rides to Britain on merchant ships. Identifying crushed snail shells in the soil of the Cernabas giant allowed scientists to pinpoint when it was made. It's an unlikely way to do it, but it totally worked. The Dolans of Korea. The dolmens of South Korea are among the biggest prehistoric monuments in the world. It's a wonder that so many of them are still standing after thousands of years, seemingly defying gravity. A dolmen, at its core, is a simple construct: 2 upright stones and a much larger stone horizontal over the top. It's the first step to a house of cards: 2 vertical cards as the walls and 1 horizontal card as the roof. Dolmens don't typically consist of more than 3 main pieces. But that doesn't mean they can't be big. In fact, they can be stupendously big. So big, they make everything else I told you about today look like plastic kids' toys. The Ungok dolmen is an excellent example of how humongous they can be. Check out this photo taken by Hyungwon Kang. The image isn't particularly flattering because the dolmen is in terrible shape. Look at how crumbly the stone is after thousands of years. The exact age of the monument is also unknown. Now that you've seen it, how heavy do you think it is? I'll give you a hint. The Ungok dolmen is considered to be the biggest in the world. It would have taken thousands of men to move it, which makes scientists scratch their heads. The dolmen, discovered in South Korea's Gochang County, weighs an astounding, unbelievable 300 tons. So how in the world did prehistoric people lift a rock that weighed so much? I don't know, and neither does anybody else. Nobody even knows precisely what dolmens were used for, but they sure were popular in South Korea. South Korea is home to about 40,000 dolmens, making up about half of all the dolmens in the world. It's incredible because there are dolmens everywhere, including Europe, Africa, and India, yet Korea has half of them. And the biggest ones, too. The oldest of them all date to the early Neolithic period, which was more than 4,300 years ago. Korea was dominated by the Joseon civilization at that time. The Joseons made huge advancements in textile weaving, made weapons of bronze, and started to farm rice. They also seem to have taken a shine to dolmens. But what on earth was the point? The best guess on the table right now is that dolmens were used as burial monuments. They were fancy graves and possibly even places of worship. Experts have compared dolmens to standing stones. Both were part of early cultures that had just started farming and were starting to become advanced. The sunken Stone Turtle of Angkor Wat. I can't wait to show you the incredible stone turtle that was found near the biggest temple complex in the world. That's right, Cambodia's Angkor. The ancient sea seat of the Khmer kings. There's a difference between Angkor and Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is the name of the religious complex where tourists watch the sunrise at 5 a.m. They snap stunning photographs of the sun as it peaks above the largest religious structure in the world. Angkor Wat is 400 acres of unparalleled Khmer architecture. Did you know that it took longer to build Angkor Wat than the Great Pyramid of Giza using essentially the same tools? Angkor Wat was built at the beginning of the 12th century during the rule of Suryavarman II. It took an estimated 300,000 men, 6,000 elephants, and 30 years to complete the temple. That's compared to the estimated 100,000 workers and the mere 20 years it took to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. Angkor is the city itself. Angkor has 154 square miles of temples, canals, towering monuments, monkeys, forests, and lakes. It was during a recent excavation within the city that archaeologists found a monumental stone turtle. It dates to the 10th century, making it 200 years older than Angkor Wat. The big discovery doesn't come with any weird secrets or strange mysteries necessarily. I just thought you might want to know about it because it's a giant stone turtle, and weirdly cute for being so ancient. It was found along with some other rare artifacts when the Sra-Sreng Reservoir was drained. The other artifacts included metal tridents, some crystals, a Naga sculpture, and sculpted fish. The director of the excavation project, Mche Priestesses, said that the turtle is one of the avatars of the Hindu god Vishnu. It was likely placed in the foundation of a temple at the beginning of its construction as a votive object. Almost everything in Angkor was dedicated to a Hindu deity, primarily Vishnu and Shiva. Before being lost to the jungle in the 15th century, Angkor was one of the most important places in the world for Hindus. The Demon Slayer Sword from Hell. How would you defend yourself from evil in the afterlife? Would you be buried with a mighty spell like the Egyptians were with their Book of the Dead? Or would you rely on a gigantic iron sword like the one just discovered in a Japanese grave? Feast your eyes on the most incredible demon-slaying sword ever forged by human hands. This is an image of the sword before it was excavated from the ancient burial mound near Japan's city of Nara. It's difficult to tell because it's still in the dirt, but the sword is enormous. It's almost 8 feet long. It's so unwieldy that it's hard to imagine somebody waving the thing around in a samurai sword fight. I mean, take a look at it for yourself. Scientists figure it was never used for self-defense of the mortal kind, but for defense of the immortal kind. The weapon, known as a Dako sword, may have been buried with somebody important for post-life protection. It was a ward against demons on the person's perilous journey through the afterlife. In many mythologies across the world, heaven wasn't as easy to get to as it is in the Christian religion. People had to fight their way to salvation, and what better way to do it than with a giant sword taller than most people? Researchers uncovered the artifact at the Tomio Maruyama archaeological site. It's about 1,600 years old, knocking the socks off archaeologists because they were so shocked. Riku Murase from the Nara Archaeological Research Center said the sword is twice as big as any other sword ever found in Japan. Ever! And that's really saying something. You likely want to know who the sword belonged to. Well, you and me both. Experts think the tomb belonged to an influential person who supported the imperial Yamato family. But they don't have any more information. The Yamatos were in the ruling class during the Kofun period, which lasted in Japan from 300 to 710 AD. Mexico's legendary monolith of Tlaloc. Earlier, I mentioned how Aztec artwork took inspiration from the work of the Olmec 2,500 years earlier. There is no better example of this than the monolith I'm about to show you. Be prepared because this thing is huge, and I mean huge. It weighs 168 tons. That's more than 5 Olmec colossal heads jammed into a single monument. You can see the enormous monument for yourself today at Mexico City's Chapultepec Park, just alongside the Paseo de Reforma. You'll have to deal with the ceaseless traffic and the honking of horns. This sculpture is that of the Aztec Rain God, equipped with supernatural powers, real powers that have been felt in this day and age. The monolith was initially discovered in the 1800s at the bottom of the dry stream bed near the small town of Coatlinchan. Villagers unearthed the unbelievable behemoth by accident. Then, over the next few years, archaeologists kept coming to study the artifact. It didn't take long for researchers to identify the sculpture as being Tlaloc, Lord of the Rains. In Aztec mythology, Tlaloc was a god with the face of a frog and googly eyes to match. He looked a little silly, but don't judge a book by its cover. For the most part, he was a kind and benevolent deity, but underneath Tlaloc's cool exterior was a ferocious temper. The one thing you did not want to do was make Tlaloc angry. So much so that even the Christian god would tell him to tone it down a notch. When he was upset, Tlaloc would prevent it from raining. It was passive aggressiveness at its most dangerous. The rain would stop, drought would descend on the land, and people would die from famine. And if he was in an especially bad mood, Tlaloc would summon a flood to wipe people out. What's even more savage is that the rain god would spread leprosy around like the common cold. I'm not sure which is worse. Leprosy, a flood, or a drought? The Aztec thought there was only one way to save themselves from the wrath of Tlaloc. To keep his fury at bay, the Aztec offered human sacrifices to the god. It was one of the most brutal aspects of the Aztec civilization. Tlaloc was said to prefer the blood of children, much like Molech from the Bible. In times of drought, the Aztec assumed their rain god was extremely angry. This would typically result in a surge of sacrifices, with the Aztec performing many ceremonies in a desperate attempt to stop Tlaloc from being mad. This amazing sculpture was built in Tlaloc's honor, perhaps at a time of drought. It stands 23 feet high, and it took a specially built trailer to transport it to Mexico City in 1963. On the day of its arrival, something unbelievable happened. In one of the driest times of the year, a sudden thunderstorm came from nowhere and swept across the city. It was a torrential downpour day after day without any logical explanation. Thousands came to behold the sculpture, which many still believe brought that epic thunderstorm to the city. Do you think it was Tlaloc who opened the skies above Mexico? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching! Don't forget to subscribe and stick around for more awesome content!
The Mche Priestesses. The Mche civilization ruled over a huge swath of Peru between 100 and 800 AD. Although they were mainly an agricultural society, the Mche also had a penchant for human sacrifice. It was the elite members of the Mche who played the biggest roles in sacrificing people, as well as consuming human blood. When the tombs of the Mche priestesses were discovered, archaeologists made some shocking new revelations regarding these ancient people. The tombs of the priestesses were found during excavations at San Jose de Moro in 1991. The priestesses had been buried wearing beautiful golden headdresses, almost like crowns, unlike anything else archaeologists have found in Peru. But these powerful women were not buried in ordinary tombs. Their graves were luxurious, filled with offerings, sacrificial goblets, necklaces, and many other treasures. The reason these four women were treated with such reverence is that they were hugely important to Mche society. The four priestesses were in charge of all ritual sacrifices and likely had high places of honor among the ruling elite. The Mche believed these women had a special connection to the gods and a powerful secret knowledge that permitted them to lead as religious rulers. Their roles were somewhat similar to the ancient oracles from Greece, only these women had far more power when it came to actually governing. The astronomical knowledge of ancient India. The Junipani stone circles in India are ancient, going back over 3,500 years to 1500 BC. Even though there are plenty of megalithic sites quite similar spread throughout the subcontinent, the Junipani stone circles are unique for one main reason. They show the earliest astronomical knowledge possessed by primitive people living in what is today the state of Maharashtra. Some of these stones are circular, some are long rectangles, and all of them were brought to where they still stand from a great distance away. Researchers believe they were intended to mark burial places, with the dead placed in the ground and then covered over with the giant stone circles. But here, unlike other stone burials in India, the ancients left circle marks called cupules carved into the stone. The organization of the marks suggests they were used as specific directions, reflecting major cosmic events such as the sunrise on the winter solstice. These ancient people very well could have had advanced knowledge of astronomy and displayed their knowledge on the stones found here. This was during a primitive time in India, a transition between stone and iron tools. Some have suggested the fact that people learned about the stars at the same time they developed iron technology is no coincidence. Of course, ancient alien enthusiasts believe that the ancient Indians may have been given knowledge on these subjects by a mysterious race far more advanced than themselves. For most, though, it is the evolution of human knowledge. The ancient Etruscan Haruspecs. The religious rituals of the Etruscans suggest they had mastered several different forms of divination or foretelling. The practice of telling the future in ancient Rome, before the Romans ever came to power, was done by special members of society called Haruspecs or Haruspices. They were also called entrail observers, and they were responsible for announcing the will of the gods to the masses. How did they do this? They observed the entrails of sacrificed animals, like their guts and insides. We don't know if these people really had some kind of secret knowledge that allowed them to see what others couldn't in the insides of an animal, but that's what everyone back then believed. These entrail observers would take the liver and gallbladder of a sacrificed sheep, then observe and interpret the blood and gore until they had determined the future. The diviners were also charged with assessing any natural phenomena or unique events, such as floods and lightning storms. Whatever secret knowledge they claimed to possess, it gave them great power in society. Even though it was almost certainly a pseudoscience, divination grew to be a legitimate way to make decrees based on the supposed will of the gods. However, things changed with the Romans. Divination was still popular when Rome was a republic, but began to lose its importance as they shifted to become an empire. That said, there were still a handful of haruspices around even in the 5th century AD, who claimed to know the will of the gods. Scented sorceresses. Most of the major ancient societies believed in the power of scent. People from all walks of life, from the lowest peasants to the greatest rulers of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, all believed in magic up until fairly recently. In ancient Greece and Rome, people believed spells, curses, and healing magic all had to do with fragrance. Egyptian magicians used smells in their rituals. Scented inks were popular because they were believed to have power, and even doctors thought plants that smelled more pungent were more medically effective. There was even a belief that the gods themselves gave off a sweet odor. Fragrance and potions went hand in hand and could even defeat monsters. We still love perfume and scented magic markers, but did the ancient people have different formulas that could influence behavior? 2,000 years ago, it was believed that certain perfumes had the power to seduce men and even change their behavior or place them under spells. The famous Roman historian Pliny the Elder once wrote that there was a perfume that could make men forget and become totally dumb to what was happening with just one whiff. While it may have been some secret ancient knowledge lost to time, it could also have been an ancient version of morphine or ether. Who knows? Big shout out to Jennifer Cassia for her donation. Thanks so much for supporting this channel. And if you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos like these and to join the Origins Explained family. The Book of Abramelin the Mage. The Book of Abramelin the Mage is an ancient grimoire of magic, a tome that's said to hold all kinds of secret and forbidden knowledge. It's believed to be the inspiration behind many of the works of Aleister Crowley and describes the life of a Kabbalist and magical scholar called Abraham of Würzburg as he journeyed from Germany to Egypt around 1362. It also goes into great detail about his magical and Kabbalistic knowledge, which he passed on to his son. Abraham recounts the tale of when he met Abramelin the Mage living in a small hermit shack in the desert, somewhere near the River Nile in Egypt. Abramelin passed his knowledge to Abraham, and Abraham to his son. The book comes in the form of 3 individual manuscripts and describes in great detail the purification process that one must go through in order to be able to utilize the great knowledge of Abramelin the Mage. Once a person is purified, they can then use spells described in the book for invocations of good and some of evil. One can use magic to acquire treasure, to force someone to love them, fly through the air, breathe underwater, and also raise the dead. But that's not all. The Book of Abramelin the Mage supposedly has instructions on how a person can transform their appearance, become invisible, and even start storms out of thin air. To do all this, it requires a mixture of magical sigils and mystical words, with these words being read in several different directions. There are also diagrams that must be recreated and rituals carried out. Do you think there's something hidden inside ancient grimoires that we simply can't understand? Let me know your thoughts on ancient magic in the comments. The Hall of Records. There is an ancient legend that says beneath the paws of the great Sphinx in Egypt that guards the pyramids of Giza, there is an entrance to a secret maze. Within this maze is a place called the Hall of Records, a library containing the most important texts having to deal with alchemy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and magic. You've probably heard of the Library of Alexandria, which was supposed to have been the greatest repository of knowledge in the world. But this secret Hall of Records that's supposedly underneath the Sphinx is home to even more forbidden knowledge and was created thousands of years before the Library of Alexandria. The issue is that nobody actually knows if the legendary Hall of Records exists. The limestone rock around the Sphinx is just too fragile to break through. It's doubtful archaeologists will dig beneath the Sphinx in search of the secret Hall of Records unless the ancient monument crumbles on its own. The geometry of the builders. After an exhaustive 5 years of research by archaeologist Anthony Johnson at Oxford University, he reached a new and exciting conclusion about Stonehenge. He says the ancient stone circle was designed and constructed using highly advanced geometry. In fact, Anthony claims the Britons living on the island during the Stone Age had such powerful knowledge of geometry it could have rivaled Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician known as the father of numbers. Yet this was 2,000 years before Pythagoras ever lived. Obviously, this discovery has major implications for Stonehenge, as well as for the people who built it. Anthony says geometrical knowledge was key in planning, prefabricating, and then erecting the stones at the henge. Anthony also says the primitive Britons learned this skill, not from some visiting aliens, but from constructing smaller and more simple monuments. In other words, they learned geometry through trial and error, teaching it to themselves. For proof, take a look at the most geometrically complicated achievement in Stonehenge. There is a circle within the henge of chalk-cut pits, each one marking the point of a 56-sided polygon roughly 240 feet in diameter. To create such a perfect shape, the builders of Stonehenge would have needed sophisticated knowledge of geometry, which they somehow mastered thousands of years before anyone else. The netherworld of Mesopotamia. Since the beginning of time, or at least the beginning of the human consciousness, we have speculated about the afterlife. That is to say, humans have wondered what happens to us when we die. The Egyptians left behind rich funerary texts and guidebooks to the afterlife. We know all about the ancient Maya trials one had to go through to reach their underworld of Xibalba. And of course, Hades in Greek mythology and the Christian heaven and hell are all pretty well known. But what about the Mesopotamian afterlife? Without the written records of their Egyptian counterparts, historians can only piece together clues to understand what they thought happened when they died. We know, thanks to the Epic of Gilgamesh, that Mesopotamians believed in the netherworld. They also believed in ghosts and gods. But what's really fascinating is that the Mesopotamians were some of the first human beings to practice religion, and so many of the stories they concocted were copied, corrupted, and passed down to other civilizations that came after them. They may have been the first to come up with the idea for the netherworld, a shadowy version of real life located deep underneath the Earth's surface. But it wasn't exactly hell. It wasn't a place of great joy, but neither of great misery. It was just a kind of bland, gray place where people went when they died, somewhat similar to aspects of the afterlife described in Greek and Roman mythology as well. The real question is whether the Mesopotamians had some kind of great secret knowledge about life after death. Remember, these are the people who created the stories of the Anunnaki, the celestial beings who came down from space and bestowed secret knowledge upon the cultures of the world, supposedly. It could be that whatever secret knowledge was handed to the Mesopotamians by the so-called Anunnaki gave them insight as to what happened to their souls after they died. The Copper Scroll. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II burned King Solomon's temple to the ground and plundered its treasures. One of the treasures stolen happened to be the Ark of the Covenant, which contained at the time the tablets upon which the 10 Commandments were written. This is all according to the Hebrew Bible. There has been a lot of speculation over what happened to the Ark of the Covenant since it was last seen 1,400 years ago, allegedly. Now we need to fast forward to 1952, when the legendary copper scroll was discovered near the Dead Sea in Israel. This was around the time that the Dead Sea Scrolls were being uncovered in caves and caverns all over the area. But the copper scroll was very different and may not have been connected to the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It could have just been buried in a cave in the same area by coincidence. Whatever the case, the scroll described a vast treasure hidden in multiple locations throughout the wilderness of old Judea. It appeared to be a treasure map pointing to the lost locations of artifacts stolen from King Solomon's temple. This scroll was found over 50 years ago, and no one has found any of the treasure yet. However, that doesn't mean the whole thing is phony. These scrolls certainly belonged to someone who had some secret knowledge of lost artifacts, but considering how long ago the scroll was put in that cave, chances are the artifacts were already found by the time the scroll was uncovered. Necro Pants. Ancient Icelandic people made magical pants. What I mean by that is that sorcerers in 17th century Iceland had the forbidden knowledge to create something called Necro Pants. Pants imbued by witchcraft to grant great fortune to whoever put them on their legs. The 17th century was a pretty rough time to be living in Iceland. There were many natural disasters, they were often raided by pirates, and the glory of the Viking Age was long gone. Life was hard, and so people frequently turned to witchcraft as a last resort to improve their situations. Even though witchcraft was popular, it still was not socially acceptable. Many people were burned at the stake for practicing witchcraft, the majority of which were male. But this didn't stop some sorcerers from making necro pants. The pants were supposed to be able to give whoever wore them unlimited wealth, but of course it was a very tough ritual. To create the pair of pants, a sorcerer needed to make a pact with a friend in which the sorcerer was given permission to skin them from the waist down upon their death. The only way to make a pair of pants was to wait for this person to die, then dig up their remains and remove the skin from the lower half of their body. This would create the pair of pants, which would then be worn over bare skin. The sorcerer then needed to steal a coin from a destitute widow, put it in the rear end of the pants, as well as an Icelandic stave written on a scrap of parchment. So long as the coin remained inside the rear end of the pants, the wearer would be rich for the rest of their life. Now, either Icelanders really had some sacred knowledge on how to make magic pants, or they were going through all of this trouble for nothing. What do you think was behind this elaborate ritual? Why do you think ancient sorcerers believed in these magic pants? Egyptian pet cemetery. In Egypt, archaeologists have unearthed a mysterious pet cemetery. While they predominantly discovered cats buried amongst the dunes, both macaque monkeys and dogs were also found in the cemetery near the ancient port of Berenice. This port was once a major shipping destination for cargo vessels from East Africa, Europe, and as far away as India. The animal remains date back to the 1st century AD, or roughly 2,000 years ago. Researchers didn't just find a handful of animals, but over 600 individual burial sites specifically for animals. About 90% of them were cats, with the rest being a handful of dogs and macaque monkeys. Many of them were clearly imported from outside Africa. Here's where things get really strange. You might expect these animals to have been mummified. After all, this is ancient Egypt we're talking about. But none of the animals had gone through the process of mummification. There were also no humans, meaning this was a dedicated pet cemetery. Archaeologists believe these animals had a special place in society. They were very likely companion animals, pets just like we have today. It seems the ancient Egyptians loved cats so much that they, like many modern pet parents, sought to have them buried next to their feline friends. The cats were also buried with grave goods. Archaeologists found pieces of pottery and beaded necklaces made from glass and shell. These cats had been dressed up in their finest jewelry before being carefully put in the ground and buried. The Demon Prison. There is a very peculiar landmark in Iran. It's called the Solomon Prison or the Demon Prison, and it is shrouded in mystery. It's such a bizarre landmark and is so closely associated with evil that the locals don't go anywhere near it. Legend has it that a demon was sealed inside of this palace by King Solomon himself, and that ever since it has been spewing out toxic gas. Even if the locals are too afraid to journey to this ancient place, tourists are not. It's become one of the main tourist destinations in Iran, with visitors wondering just how true the stories are. Is there really a demon hidden beneath what is essentially a giant hole in the ground? But this was actually a prison. It was built during the Sassanid dynasty, which ruled from between 224 and 651 AD. This was over 1,000 years after King Solomon was already dead. The people who built the demon prison used a naturally formed hill that had risen into the shape of a cone over thousands of years. Inside is a sulfur hot spring, which is where the toxic gas comes from. It's basically a volcano filled with salt and sulfur. The demon prison was made at its very top, a rough stone building once used for human sacrifice. The Zoroastrian priests would bring people to the top of the prison, then push them into the volcano as offerings to their terrible gods. Either that, or they would lock them in the tower and let the toxic fumes kill them. Pretty dark stuff. Would you risk checking out this frightening tourist destination? The Bell Witch Cave. The Bell Witch Cave can be found in Adams, Tennessee. According to local folklore, the cave was once home to a terrible witch who plagued the early settlers. The disturbances allegedly started in the summer of 1817, when the witch began terrorizing the Bell family. The Bells had a farm nearby and were just trying to scrape by on the land when they became assailed by an evil witch who would attack them for no apparent reason. She ended up poisoning the father of the family, John Bell, and tormenting his daughters for years. The witch claimed that she was the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, John Bell's ex-neighbor. She claimed John had cheated her out of a land purchase. She was so angry with John that after she died, she resurrected herself as a witch and destroyed his family. It's easy for us to dismiss this as nothing but an old story, but there appears to be some truth to it. For example, former President Andrew Jackson once said that he would rather face the entire British Army than spend one more night with the Bell Witch. This was after he and some of his troops spent a night at the Bell's old farm. Of course, we don't know if there really was a witch living in this creepy cave, nor for how long it's been a source of terrible evil, but it is still one of the creepiest ancient places that you can find in the United States. Russia's City of the Dead. Russia's City of the Dead is one of the most mysterious places on the planet. Its real name is Dargavs, an old village with an ancient cemetery filled with hundreds of eerie stone crypts. The village was built around the 13th century and has been abandoned for at least 100 years, maybe more. Information about this mysterious city is a little scarce, since it's so remote and people are so frightened of it. Even these days, Russians stay far away from the City of the Dead. Many people fear that any living person who enters the city will never make it out alive. The rumors likely started in the 18th century when a terrible sickness swept through the region. Local clans began building quarantine houses to separate sick family members from the healthy ones. It was a terrible time, with sick people loitering in the cemetery waiting to die. It was slow and painful, and the plague was everywhere. By the time the sickness was over, the crypts were filled with festering bodies that nobody wanted to bury. People abandoned the place and left the town to rot, never to return. Dead Man's Island. Dead Man's Island is one of the most ghoulish places in the United Kingdom. It's a small island just off the coast of Kent, used 200 years ago as a burial site. The whole place is uninhabited, currently owned by Natural England and leased to 2 people. They keep it as a protected area. The island is completely out of bounds, with no one allowed to visit unless they have permission from the leaseholders. Because the island is an important breeding and nesting site for birds, archaeologists aren't allowed to do any excavations. But none of this changes the fact that there are dozens and dozens of human bones scattered across the island. The remains are believed to belong to men and young boys who died from contagious diseases while imprisoned. These people weren't stuck in normal jails. They were instead locked in floating cells on board prison ships. They were basically stuck in the hulls of ships that were moored off Dead Man's Island. As you can likely guess, these were not the most sanitary prisons. Sickness was rampant, people died almost as soon as they went in, and their bodies were usually dumped on this isolated piece of rock. The issue now is that rising sea levels and coastal erosion have started revealing wooden coffins and human remains. Many of them have been lost at sea, swept away by the currents. The rest, the bones that still litter the island, are left to naturally erode or be stolen by birds. A horrid end for anyone, even those that were imprisoned. Davilis Cave. North of Athens is Davilis Cave, a place of great mystery that has perplexed locals for centuries. Ever since the 1800s, reports of paranormal activity have been made by Greeks going near the cave, which is carved into the side of Mount Penteli. Anyone who visits this strange place won't be surprised that it's connected to stories of supernatural horrors. The cave entrance looks innocent enough until you enter through it and find yourself in a twisting and turning labyrinth of tunnels going deep into the mountain to a pool of stagnant water in the center. It is truly a frightening place, and even the ancient Greeks thought so. Throughout various excavations, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts linked to the mischievous Greek god Pan and his nymphs. This suggests there was some kind of cultic activity going on here thousands of years ago, but that activity may never have stopped. There have been local reports of Satanists gathering deep in the caverns here. In the 1980s, the cave was even sealed by the Greek government with no explanation. Folks who visit Davalis Cave these days say their electronics don't work and that water sometimes flows the wrong way. Some people have even allegedly disappeared without a trace after venturing into the darkness. Do you think there are mysterious or paranormal forces at work here? Let me know in the comments below. The Catacombs of Domitilla. The Catacombs of Domitilla are concealed deep beneath the surface of the Roman countryside. It is a vast and creepy underground city dedicated to the dead. Construction began on these secretive underground tunnels in the 1st century AD by the Domitilla family of Rome. They were used up until around the year 400 and go nearly a mile under the surface. Over 26,000 tombs to this day still hold the remains of humans. It's one of the most amazingly preserved catacombs in all of Europe. The dark and dripping passages were rediscovered 1,000 years after they were abandoned by the archaeologist Antonio Bosio in 1593. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was still pagan, and the people still actively practiced, worshipped, and believed in all their old gods. But something was changing. Christianity had taken root in Rome, and small communities of believers were cropping up in the city. Over decades, Christianity grew stronger, and they began to butt heads with the Roman pagans. One of the biggest things they argued about was how to dispose of their dead loved ones. The pagans of ancient Rome simply burned their dead in funeral pyres, but the Christians believed that the body needed to be resurrected when Jesus returned, and so they needed cemeteries. The solution was that Christians could safeguard their dead in a cemetery outside the city limits, and so the Catacombs of Domitilla were created. All these years later, many of the dead people put into the tombs are still there, still waiting to be resurrected on the day Jesus Christ returns. Draculas Castle. There are some serious misunderstandings when it comes to the legendary castle of Dracula. For anyone who's ever taken a trip to Romania, you're undoubtedly familiar with Bran Castle, which is advertised as a major tourist destination, as if Vlad the Impaler actually lived there. The truth is that he had a much closer connection to a place called Poenari Castle. This is the real impenetrable fortress of Vlad the Impaler, the original Dracula. Poenari Castle is perched on the top of a cliff like a big stone eagle's nest overlooking the vast Romanian countryside. It's at an altitude of over 2,400 feet, originally built in the 13th century as the seat for the House of the Basarabs. But after only a couple decades, the castle high in the Carpathian Mountains was abandoned. It's still in such a wild place today that the only way to reach it is by taking a local bus, getting dropped off on the side of a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, and then walking through the forest. When Vlad the Impaler ruled Wallachia in the 15th century, the castle was already ruined. Historical records show that he came upon the broken structure one day by accident while hunting and recognized its strategic value. He then used his enslaved enemies to repair the structure and turn it into one of his main fortresses. However, the castle never saw a lot of action. After Vlad died in 1476, it was abandoned again. Within another few decades, it had once more turned into a ruin. Then in 1913, a landslide caused the castle to be damaged beyond any hope of repair, crumbling in on itself. There's barely anything left today of this terrifying fortress. Irish Gate to Hell. The Irish Hell Cave is where the celebration of Halloween was born. The reason people dress up as monsters and ask for candy on October 31st of every year can be traced back to a field in Ireland. That's all it is today, an otherwise unremarkable field occupied by sheep. The entrance to the cave is overgrown and kind of hidden. But 2,000 years ago, costumed pagans were sacrificing animals here while dancing and chanting in celebration of Celtic demons. The ancient Celts of Ireland believed the nearby cave was a passage leading directly to the otherworld, a place of terrible evil infested with demons and devils. It was here where the Festival of Sound was born, the very first Halloween. According to Irish archaeologist Daniel Curley, pagans would sacrifice animals on top of a great mound, inside the walls of a temple that has since crumbled to dust and been erased. October 31st may have been a day of terror here in Ireland, but the rest of the year was pretty normal. The region of Rathcrogan, where the Hell Cave is, boasts over 200 archaeological sites. There are burial mounds, ring fortresses, standing stones, and sanctuaries from the Iron Age. And of course, the gateway to the otherworld. This was a major center for Celtic activity. They lived, farmed, and sacrificed animals once a year to a host of demonic spirits. Ancient ritual site. A positively enormous ritual site has been discovered in Poland, dating back 6,800 years. Archaeologists believe the site was used by Neolithic people in some mysterious and probably disturbing ceremonies. The ritual site consists of a circular structure about 360 feet in diameter, making it 3 times bigger than the inner circle of Stonehenge. It was first spotted in 2017 in a village about 50 miles from Berlin. What researchers are trying to do now is figure out what exactly this structure was used for. In other words, what could have convinced a group of Neolithic humans to waste valuable time building a monolithic structure like this? The only thing that makes sense is that it was for community rituals. Flint artifacts have been found here, along with hundreds of fragments of bone, ceramics, and seashells. It all points to worship, but what kind? Were people sacrificed? What about animals? Was it a place of horror or happiness and rejoicing? These are the questions archaeologists are working to answer. Thanks for watching! Which of these spooky ancient places would you love to visit? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon for more videos like these. Bye!